So I'd like to welcome Professor Ruth Aylett from Heriot-Watt University, and who's going to tell us about her current project, isn't it? Interactive digital storytelling.
Okay, so I think I'll start by saying I'm not a graphics person primarily. Okay, so some people look at the graphics in some of our work and go, no, that's not very good, is it? Fine, but that's not my expertise. I'm really an artificial intelligence person who happens to be working in graphical systems because I'm interested in interactive digital storytelling. So I've been interested in this for more than 10 years now, something like 15 years. From when I started thinking about this just before 1999, I think, I did a paper on it, thinking about what the problems were and how to deal with them. We're still thinking about the problems and how to deal with them. It's quite an interesting and difficult area. So hopefully I'll explain the vision, what prompts people to research this area, and then the problem with the vision. Well, there are always problems, but there's a key problem in this vision, which I'll talk about. Something about emergent narrative, which was my idea for dealing with this problem. That's what I came out with back in 1999. Nice idea, difficult to execute. Something about characters, which are heavily involved in emergent narrative, and a few examples from the stuff we've been doing, which involves running some video clips, of course. So, the vision. Anyone who remembers the original Star Trek, or even subsequent Star Treks? Any of you seen Star Trek?
Yeah.
Yeah? Remember the holodeck?
Yes.
Okay, so this vision struck people around the time I started writing about this. I was then working in a virtual reality centre, so we were thinking in terms of 3D interactive graphics. The hype on virtual reality at the time was indistinguishable from reality, which is never going to be, let me tell you, for quite strong reasons to do with physics and matter, which is not what you get with graphics, okay? Nevertheless, this was the vision. So here's the holodeck as it looks in the real world. It's the inside of a spaceship. And then the computer projects wonderful stuff into it, and there it is as a jungle, and there's one of the Star Trek characters coming in from the spaceship, and now he's going to have a little adventure in the jungle. This was just something all going stir-crazy on a spaceship between the stars for lots and lots of years. So that was the general idea. It would be like a whole world, which would be like the real world. Well, how far have we got? We can produce immersive display systems. This is an example of an immersive display system, in this case a tiled display. It doesn't look very like a jungle all encompassing you, does it? Here's another one. This is in the inside of a cave. Very difficult to film in these. It's a display system with panels all around you, quite expensive to set up. Not as expensive as it used to be. The guys in St Andrews are building their own at the moment. And in principle, you can build one. It just takes some time and effort and some technical knowledge to do it now. And the idea here, again, is that the display envelops you. You project onto screens around the person, so they're standing in the middle, usually a stereo projected scene, so you'll be wearing stereo glasses. And this can seem quite real. So just to give you an example of how this might look, at least we hope so, this was, it doesn't have to be naturalistic incidentally, this was a demo world distributed with caves a long time ago. I remember this from about 2000. So this is what it actually looks like. You see the panels. This is fairly old kit because it's got cables on it. And these days it would be wireless kit. Those are the glasses. That's the navigation device. And this is what it looks like. So this is Crayon World. It's not intended to be particularly naturalistic. Sound effects, often underused sound in virtual environments. And that's your hand, you can see there. There's a butterfly settling on your hand, so there's a level of interactivity. You can pick the flowers, so here we are picking one of the flowers. They're flat flowers because it's a crayon land, of course. It's quite intentional. You can walk around the hut. I've done this, I've used this world. And you can bash the bees, my favourite bit. Wow, and all the bees fly out all around you and make a terrific racket. Actually, they don't really sting you, of course. Okay, so that's Crayon World. But of course, that's not quite the holodeck, but that's good fun, I must say. So let's have a look at the holodeck. I found an episode of the holodeck, which I quite enjoyed. It's a short clip from it. This is from Jean-Luc Picard. Ooh, what happened there? I think something crashed. Let's try that again. Be careful with your fingers when you do this kind of thing. Weird things can happen. Okay, let's try that again. I was trying to make the display a bit bigger when that particular thing went wrong. So he's setting up an episode, if you wonder what this little bit is. It's the shot right at the beginning, at the entrance to the holodeck, and he's setting up an episode. And just to give you the backstory, the ship has been invaded by baddies, the Borg in this case, and he's desperate to find some way of combating them, and his way of combating them involves the holodeck. So real life and the virtual world are about to clash.
I have something inside.
So here they are coming into the holodeck.
I'm sorry, gentlemen, but we're close.
This is a computer-generated character, as they're about to find out. Because he's really there. So
take a nose and hopes as an inhaler at once. This is the wrong chapter. Computer, begin chapter 13.
it's now leaping into the next chapter of this particular sequence. So they're the only real characters there, apart from the Borg. He's looking to nick the nose, you'll find out in a minute, for a particular reason. So there are the other real characters. He's going to nick the nose. There's this little silver nose, hence its name. Off he goes to nick the nose. And here's a computer-generated character grabbing him.
This is not your time.
It's not the time for us, is it? Expectable as an excuse? Is that the case you're working on?
I have to talk to Nikki. I'll see you later.
Okay. Go wash your shoes. And don't look away.
Get dragged in. Good shake your beaks.
The usual neck, martinis and skirts. Excuse me. Second, no offense.
So that was the point of all this drama, is that he shoots the ball. Stop it there, you can see that this is going to end happily for the Borg. Of course, the interesting thing about this is this has real physics, so the bullets are real bullets and they really do kill the Borg, even though it's actually a virtual world. Interesting problem, you might say. So if we go back to this now. Okay, so that would be the drama on the holodeck. Let's leave the physics issue aside, okay? That's poetic license. Without real-world physics, you don't get real-world physical effects. If it had real-world physics, it wouldn't be a virtual world. It would actually be the real world with real matter in it and real bullets and so on and so forth. But that is not my point in this case. So the crunch is that you could see in there that the actors appeared to have freedom to act. So Jean-Luc Picard has a plan, it's true, but he's making decisions on the hoof how to execute his plan. He's not told he's got to do it like this. Yeah, so he dances around. When he finds Nick the Nose isn't there, he goes into another episode. He's watching the Borg. When the computer-generated character comes up, he doesn't interact with her because it conflicts with his plan. He says, not now. The computer-generated character takes the brush off, as she might not have done, incidentally. It could have been a different story. So there's apparent freedom to interact. And in some sense, if you're going to go to all this trouble to put people in an interactive environment, what is the point if you don't give them freedom to interact? What is the point? However, this does seem to clash with the need for narrative structure. We all think of a story as having some dramatic shape. And that story had a dramatic shape because it was a film and they determined that in advance because it was authored. They didn't really have interactive freedom. They were actually following a script. You were only spectators, so you didn't notice this. It looked as if they had freedom of action. We always give this illusion in the films, but in fact they didn't. It looked as if they could have chosen to do something else, but in fact they couldn't. So Jean-Luc Picard could have chosen to ignore the Borg and go off with his girlfriend in the computer world instead, and that would have been a different story. She could have chosen to take no notice of being brushed off. There could have been a fight between the two women or whatever. Yeah? A whole lot of different things could have happened. And what did happen had a nice dramatic structure. So we've got a conflict here, really, because they could have chosen to do things, in principle, if it was really an interactive environment, that would have wrecked that dramatic structure. It was only because it was a film that they in fact, couldn't make those choices. So how do we deal with this? Well, if we go back to Choose Your Own Adventure, anyone remember these? Yes, they're books you could buy which say, go to page whatever. You usually get about 3 choices. I used to try all 3 normally to see which one looked the most interesting, so I'd end up with lots of fingers in the book trying to explore which way the story was going. An easier way of representing it looks like this. This is the diagram for the Mystery of Chimney Rock. And in fact, you can see, although you can't see all the boxes from where you're sitting, I think you can roughly see the structure. So up here, there are 2 main branches in the story. This branch leads to stuff down here, and that branch leads to stuff over there. There's one way of getting from this clump into the bottom there, and one way there, and there's one way of getting from this clump into the bottom there. But broadly speaking, if you branch up here, you're going to get fairly different stories. There's the branch point here, where you can see there's a big clump of stuff here, and another big clump of stuff here. So broadly, you've got something, there's a little clump over here. So broadly, you've got about 4 stories in there, in fact, and you're creating the illusion of choice by branching down these particular branches. So yeah, you can do that. We have done this for some time in interactive narrative and graphical environments. But let's just say it's not necessarily the answer. The problem is that if you want more than 4 stories, you're liable to end up with an explosion. It starts to escape your brain. You can't be sure that the paths are coherent. There's an amount of material you need. Do you know that you've linked things that should be linked? Are there other possible links? It all gets a bit out of control. Computer games are doing it like this at the moment, incidentally, though not like that. Not even as complicated as that Choose Your Adventure game, as far as I know. They typically have maybe 3 branches in their story, sometimes just 2 branches, with a little bit of branching back in, so you might think you've branched off, but it will force you back into the main track further down. So branching is what people have been doing. So being an AI person, along with lots of other AI people, I think to myself, is there a better way of doing this, which isn't so coercive? I must say that you notice this being pushed into branches of the story. It's not difficult to notice in most cases. Where you'd like to do something, you suddenly find you can't do it, and you think, oh, that's because they want me to do this, and that's because it's... And that really pulls you out of the story environment. So, technology called AI planning was co-opted at a fairly early stage in this. So, what's AI planning? It's a technology that dates back to the mid-70s, used for robots originally. And broadly, the idea is that we have representations of plans. So if you think of those boxes, those S boxes in there as being different states you could be in. And if you think of these preconditions here as being preconditions for being in that state. So from your initial state, if this becomes true, then we could be in that state. If that becomes true, we could be in that state, maybe in that state, and so on. We could end up at our goal. This looks like a branching thing, you may say, so how's that different from what I just showed you? Well, the difference is that an AI planner works this out as it goes along. It doesn't predetermine it, so it takes the authoring, predetermined authoring, out of the equation altogether and tries to run clever algorithms that will construct this branching system on the fly. As a result, you can have much bigger branching systems potentially, because you don't have to represent them all. You just represent the particular path you've taken through all the possible branches that it could have generated, but in fact hasn't done in this particular instance. So that seems like a very promising technology for doing this kind of thing. You can give examples. Making a cup of instant coffee is a sort of example not very story example, but I often use this one just to make people clear about what the technology can and can't do. So in making a cup of instant coffee, some things have to be done in the right order. If you start trying to pour the water into the cup before you got the cup out of the cupboard, your plan will fail. On the other hand, it doesn't matter that much whether you pour the water into the cup first or put the coffee in the cup first. It will work both ways. So what this branching system is actually doing, using a bit of logic, is to put in order the things that have to be in order for it to work properly, and just leaving in parallel things that could be in parallel, where you don't have to put them in order. So it doesn't matter really what order you do things. So that allows you to have some choice over the order things happen in as well. So steps have preconditions and effects. Those P's are for preconditions, and then there are effects coming out of them. And each box you could think of as being the state you get into by doing some action. And what the algorithm is doing is picking up the actions and sticking them in the plan. So in my coffee example, get cup out of cupboard, well, would probably be a generic action, get something out of the cupboard, or get something out of somewhere even, where the cup in this case and the cupboard in this case are the things at issue. An action, get something out of somewhere, of course, is quite generic. You can imagine lots of different plans that had that action in, where it wasn't necessarily a cup and a cupboard. In fact, that was in the holodeck I showed you. Jean-Luc Picard got the submachine gun out of the violin case, which is the same sort of action, except in this case it was a submachine gun and a violin case rather than a cup and a cupboard. From a planning point of view, those are pretty much equivalent actions, except you can't shoot people with a coffee cup, of course. And then these links capture the temporal and causal relationships, so that it all pans out in a fairly... And it can automatically plan things. So, say the user kills a vital character. That could happen in a story. You could take a strong dislike to somebody important and you could shoot them. So say Jean-Luc Picard had a brainstorm and he'd shot his girlfriend. That would have produced a different story, wouldn't it? You wouldn't expect the story to be exactly the same if he'd done that. So we can imagine a planning system which takes this into account and reinstates bits of plan. So this P5 thing here is where I've done something. I wanted to go from S2 to S3, but I've done something which messes up that P5. I've killed a character, which is necessary for that S3 thing to happen. So now it can't happen. Maybe I locked the cupboard, so now you can't get the coffee out of the cupboard without doing something else. So you can reuse an existing step. In this case, we had an action which made P5 true, so we can just say, okay, well that S3 thing has to happen after that one instead. So we have some way of making it true some other way. That wouldn't help much with the shooting the wrong person, but it would help with locking the cupboard. So we can just stick another action in. So in this case, I've stuck in an action that the gun jams. As a result, he can't shoot anyone with the gun, so he can't shoot a character with it. In this case, the Borg would probably win, but there you go. It'd be a different plan. The problem you've got is something called character coherence if you start doing this kind of thing. It's all very well looking at this from a logic-y point of view, but in a story, characters should mostly behave in character, and when they don't behave in character, there should be some motivation for not behaving in character. So that's a bit of an issue, doing this kind of thing, and I've got an example of this, Robin Hood and the Golden Arrow. So this is, people know the story of Robin Hood and the Golden Arrow? Robin Hood in heavy disguise. Robin Hood, the man who robs from the rich in order to give to the poor, and has this enemy called the Sheriff of Nottingham, who's after him. Robin Hood turns up at the Goose Fair in Nottingham, where, of course, the Sheriff of Nottingham is presiding, in disguise, that's his disguise, the eye patch and the hat, in order to take part in the shooting competition. So here you are, you're playing Robin Hood in this particular story, and you've turned up at the Goose Fair to take part in the shooting competition. In the story, he wins the Golden Arrow because he's a wonderful shot. And so you're playing this Robin Hood character and you think, yeah, but here I am, I'm at a shooting competition, and that's my biggest enemy over there. Why don't I just shoot him? Okay, so bling, I shoot him. What's my planner going to do about this? Well, the easy thing to do is to have the arrow miss, actually, because the arrow's under our control, not under your control. So the arrow misses. Rats, I missed it. Let's have another shot at him. Bling! Oh, we miss again. You do this 3 times, it's pretty clear you're not allowed to shoot the Sheriff of Nottingham. And you're Robin Hood, who's a dead shot. Okay, so what you've produced is a character inconsistency, because Robin Hood should be able to shoot absolutely anything in character, even the Sheriff of Nottingham, but here he's not allowed to shoot the Sheriff of Nottingham. And that immediately pushes people out of the story, and they go, oh right, the story's telling me I can't do this. I'm not allowed to do that in this story. That's the kind of effect we're trying to deal with, we're trying to prevent. So, right. Let's go back and have a think about stories then, and see if we can think of a way around this. So what are stories? Well, planning sequences actions, which is good. And is the story just a sequence of actions? And the answer is, of course, no, a story is not just a sequence of actions, is it? Life is a sequence of actions, and not everything that happens in life is a story. We know that. So that was why we had an author in the first place, because the author was supposed to produce sequences of actions which were story actions and not just like the real world. There's a lot of stuff in the real world that's not very interesting from a story point of view. And now we're saying if we have an author, we're going to effectively tell people what to do in the story. So now our problem becomes a conflict with the author and the author's intentions if we're not careful. How are we going to deal with that? Well, the story has causation as well as sequence. We don't just want any sequence of actions, we want satisfying reasons for actions. There's normally some causal sequence in the story. If actions appear to be random, they don't feel very story-like. The fact that everything connects into some overarching series of causes gives us a feeling of story unity. But any plan, and the planner does deal with that, it does give you causal links, but any plan still isn't a story. And to give an example of this, this is Forster's famous example from a book he wrote about novels way back. The king died and then the queen died. He says it's a sort of minimal story, but it's not a very interesting story, it's just a sequence of actions. So he says, well, you need to put a causation in, and here we've got the king died and then the queen died of grief. Now, I will point to the fact that the cause is actually the character experiencing an emotion. So I'll come back to this. Okay? And emotion isn't a word I've mentioned up to now in talking about stories, and it's often not mentioned in narratology, incidentally. Narratology often tends to be rather plot-focused, in my experience, rather than character-focused. So what I'm going to try and do is move all this back towards character as a way of dealing with this problem. So, stories are events that happen to people. Alright, you can write stories about things that are not people, but normally you're anthropomorphising them if you do that. So they are still about people. Even two rocks can be turned into people, and various animals, as in Aesop's fables. So, actions cause change in the world. So a person does stuff, and this is a cause of things happening in the world. You have actors, in other words, people are doing stuff in stories. But of course the world also bites back, and events cause changes in the people. And that's usually emotional state. Alright, they may just get killed, but normally being killed is thought of as an unpleasant emotional experience. So you get a cycle here between the person and the world. Okay? We also want this dramatic trajectory, but a lot of this dramatic trajectory is also to do with emotions. If you think about it, if you watch one of these things, which incidentally I'm not talking about doing here, I'm talking about being in the story rather than watching the story, not the same thing. But if you watch one of these stories, you normally think of these climaxes as involving emotional state in the protagonists. So the hero is in a desperate situation, full of fear and tension, and then with one bound he is free, and you get the fall down there in the denouement, and success, and everyone goes away happy, or not. So we're evoking empathy quite often, back to emotion again. Yeah, we ask people to identify with the protagonist, in some sense to act as surrogates for the emotional transitions of the protagonists. Now, there are people who buck this, as in every art form, okay, and I'm not going to tell you there's a universal theory for stories, because I think that's rather unlikely, given the cultural embedding of story in society. The way the ancient Greeks thought about tragedy is not the way we think about tragedy, because our worldview is very different. Nevertheless, in our worldview, empathy is extremely important. we can produce stories in which we don't empathise with any of the characters. And there are people who will do this. All right? They're a specific sort of experience where you don't empathise with anybody. You think, well, what a complete shower of characters those are. It's hard to feel involved in that story. Well, I find it hard anyway. Some people may like those. So, we want structure. How are we going to get that? These are examples of structure that we've wanted through the ages. That's the hero's journey. And you can analyse stories and see some of these structures. But rather than trying to force people into these structures, is there not another way of producing structure? So this is the idea of emergent structure. Now if you look around the world, you'll see there is structure in the world, and not all of it is actually planned, predetermined, authored structure. So that's structure. And somebody did not go out there with a rake and make all those ripples in the sand. That was done by interaction between the wind and the sand. Nor is there someone sitting at the top here making those lovely little patterns of ripples. That happens as an interference pattern because of the way the waves hit things here and then interact with each other as they fall back. Nor did anyone sit down and tell the sunflower head to produce those nice little spirals. That's to do with the way the seed is sat in the sunflower, and the same would be true of animal markings and lots of other bits of structure you can see in the world. So the world is actually full of structure, but most of it is not planned structure. It's not do this, then do that structure. It's emergent structure, and it's emerged because of interaction between things. Birds do not say, let's make a nice little V. There are good reasons why they fly in a V. It's to do with the fact that the wind is less if you sit just behind somebody else. So the strongest bird tends to end up out the front, and the others freeload a bit. As the front bird gets tired, it falls back, and the next strongest bird will tend to end up at the front. That's what happens when V's are formed. If you've seen these ones, starlings, wonderful structure. Anyone seen those? They really are amazing. Those, and of course, there's no planning going on there. The starlings are not going, right guys, we'll do pattern A today. Yeah. Can we do this ourselves? Yes, we can. I'm going to see the game of life. So this is a small computer program. It's played on a little grid like this. And what happens here is that there are some very simple rules which determine whether a square carries on in the next state or dies in the next state. Broadly, if there are the right number of people around you, you survive. If there are too many people around you, you die. If there are not enough people around you, you die. And in certain configurations around a blank square, a new thing will come into being. So here we are. If you start with this configuration, apply those rules, this is what you get. But the interesting thing after 6 is that you get this repetition. Yeah? And it just does that, let me tell you. There's, I've actually got a game of life here. I might have a little demo here, we'll see what this one is. No, I'm not going to do that, I don't have time. Okay, we'll forget about that one. I could run you the game of life, but I don't really have time in this talk to do it. So broadly, you know what will happen only when you do it. You can't look at that cross, I haven't shown you the rest of it, and go, okay, I can see from looking at that cross that you're going to get a repeating pattern later on. You'd only know that if you'd run it and actually seen it. Now you can probably see the analogy I'm making here with stories, okay? Because I'm talking about mechanisms which happen on the fly in order to preserve the interactive freedom of the characters, and I'm talking about generating structure like that, without it having to be prescribed in the initial state exactly how this will unfold. Now you can look at that and go, all right, you know, what does it actually mean though for doing it? Well, it means the initial state is important. It means the interactive rules are important. Given that initial state and given the rules for interaction that I gave you, this will happen every time. Okay, that will happen every time if I make those choices. If I have a bigger set of rules or a different set of rules, particularly if I have a different initial state incidentally, you'll get something completely different. And there are all kinds of wonderful things in the game of life. There's one set up where it'll produce something called, I forget what we call this now, it fires things out. Well, it looks as if it's firing things out. You get a sort of gun episode thing. little blobs of cells come out and move across the screen, and another one moves across the screen. It's sort of an animation. And you can't determine just by looking at the initial state that this animation will take place. You have to run it in order to see it. Okay, so I'm making an analogy, but analogies are kind of interesting. So how about we start from a character-based narrative? All of the systems I've looked at where structure emerges do so because small entities interact in interesting ways and produce bigger structures. So this would suggest that if you want to do it with stories, you've got to start with the characters. The characters are our entities. We need to find initial states and interaction rules, which mean they will interact in ways which produce narrative structure. So it's a bottom approach, we call this emergent narrative. We still want to use all that nice planning technology, but now instead of having a big planner at the top trying to organise everybody, we give each character its own little planning system. So its planner, if you like, are its rules of interaction. It's how it's going to decide what to do. So I think of it as being a bit like this. The green thing is the story world, okay? All story worlds have boundaries, so this has boundaries as well. The little things in the middle with smiles are characters. The arrows are essentially what action they're taking, and you can see they'll interact with each other. They'll bounce off each other and do things. The initial conditions are how we actually laid this out to start with, and that will obviously have a huge effect on what actually happens in there as we unroll. And external events, because we have a boundary, we can have events from outside the boundary. And events like that might be introduce a new character, kill a character off, create physical actions inside there. In fact, my Robin Hood example was an external event. As I said, we're stopping him from killing Robin Hood. You want characters to stand under that tree over there? Well, why don't you make it rain and see if that's where they go to shelter? So you can imagine kind of lots of story-shaping events which will tend to push people in the direction you think will make an interesting story. You don't actually have to just leave it to the characters all the time. The advantage of this is that it always respects character coherence. The characters will do what the characters want to do in this situation. They won't suddenly find themselves having to be the boldest character on earth because the plot requires that somebody's got to kill the monster and you happen to be the one on the spot. So even if you're a really timid character, it's you that's going to do it. And it's responsive. This means that we have got some interactional freedom. It's going to respond to what you, as an external user doing in this world, are actually doing. So we can imagine the characters in that holodeck world being driven by something like this. Of course, the downside is, well, emergent structure is emergent. Yeah? Not every collection of characters is necessarily going to produce an interesting story. You throw a bunch of people together and say, right, have a story. Does that mean they're going to have a story? It's clearly not as simple as that. And it may not meet your global goals. You may have a story, but it may not be the right sort of story. So Jean-Luc Picard could have done various stories, but they probably wouldn't all have resulted in the Borg being shot, which was the aim of this particular story, was to have the Borg be shot. So, can this actually work? Well, there are real-world examples. This is live-action role-play. Well, this is board-based role-play. Without a computer. So these are people playing things like Dungeons and Dragons, but indeed not always Dungeons and Dragons. There are lots of science fiction ones and various other worlds. You meet every week, usually for sometimes weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. You have a huge story, and people have a satisfying experience. Yes, there is a game master, but the game master isn't forcing you to do things. The game master is responding to the things you do, and you set up as the game master the initial world or the conditions and some of the character characteristics, but other than that, it's up to you guys to play the game. And indeed, you can do this in the real world as well. So particularly in Nordic countries, there's live-action role-play, Nordic LARP, it's called, where people go away for a whole weekend. This bunch of people are playing some kind of military LARP, so they're all dressed up in costume. They have actually annexed some old Second World War artefacts to play it in. One big LARP annexed an old oil tanker or something like this. It was a big old boat, naval boat, I think. And they turned it into a starship interior. And everyone played a starship game in there with computers and all sorts of other things. I know the game which replayed the evacuation of the Jews from Norway in World War II, which really involved people in real time getting boats and things like this. So some quite elaborate role play. These are mostly very satisfying story experiences. We played one, and we got some Swedish guys to organise one for us in August here, well, at our university. We did an evening on the French Revolution, which took place in a cafe near Calais, involving aristocrats trying to escape from the revolution, revolutionary guards looking for the aristocrats trying to escape from the revolution, and possible people smugglers who were going to put you on a boat to Britain where you would be safe. And this ran for 3 or 4 hours. It was a fairly intense experience. I missed it, unfortunately, but from what I hear. So, what's required to make this stuff work? Strong characters, because you're going to proceed from the characters. We're trying to link events to emotion in the characters, to action from the characters, which will then give us that little story cycle I talked about. We can draw on psychology for this. I'm going to kind of skate through this bit, but we can draw on something called cognitive appraisal theory and coping theory to do this. What's all that about? Well, broadly what it's about is this diagram under here. And what this diagram says is something which intuitively I think feels quite plausible, which is you've got various goals and beliefs as an individual. You look at things that happen in the external world and you appraise them in relation to your goals and beliefs. You're not a blank sheet of paper. Something happens around you. Most of the time it's like, what's in this for me? Is this good for me? Is this bad for me? How do I feel about this? The feeling is generated by the appraisal in this theory. And once you've got a feeling, you can then cope with it in several different ways. So my standard example is you walk down the street and somebody you don't know comes up and shouts at you. So your appraisal is going to produce quite a lot of negative feelings here, probably a mixture of anger and fear. You'll be angry because, what have I done? And you'll be scared because you're not sure what they're going to do. So those are the emotions. You could cope in 2 main sorts of ways. Problem-focused, you could shout back as a result of feeling angry, or you could run away as a result of feeling scared. Both of those would be actions in the world. You could just adjust your internal state a bit. You could say, this person is clearly crazy, I have no reason to be shouted at like this, I'm just going to walk on and take absolutely no notice at all, so I'm not going to change what I was doing. In other words, you're controlling the anger and fear and not letting them drive your behaviour. So you can produce quite complex models of characters using this sort of setup. There's a nice book which tells you how to do it, which many of us in computing have been using, quite an old book. This is not the latest scientific theory, let me tell you, as any psychologist will, but the book's only about that thick and it's terribly clear and it's quite easy to computerise. So loads of us have actually been using this, and this gives you groups of feelings and it gives you ways of producing rules what to do about it. So the idea is that if an event happens and it's good for you, you feel joy. If an event happens and it's bad for you, you feel distress. If an event happens to somebody else and you like them, you feel happy for them. If an event happens to somebody else and it's bad for them and you don't like them, you gloat. If it's good for them and you didn't like them, you feel resentment. If it's bad for them and you like them, you feel sorry for them, and so on. You can see how you can produce a nice little taxonomy of emotions like this. Okay, so finally some examples of things we've been doing. We started doing this in a system called Fear Not. These have typically been educational systems, and this is because it's very hard to get funding for emergent narrative, or indeed any kind of narrative. AHRC, who might be interested in this, don't have any money, and the scientific bodies, you can imagine what it's like going to a scientific body and going, well, actually, I'm going to work on stories. And it's like, right. Okay. Education, on the other hand, you can find funding for. So we were educating against bullying using virtual drama. So I'll give you a little example of this, hopefully. This is where you're going to go the... I've seen better graphics than this. This was our first attempt at this kind of thing, and I will warrant that you have seen better graphics than this. But we weren't a games company. I'm going to push this on a bit. So this was a desktop application for children to educate them about bullying. And broadly, this is logging on. This is different for girls and boys, because this was aimed at 9 to 11-year-olds, they're a bit gender sensitive. So, this is what happens.
This is Janet. She has been a pupil at Meadowview School for 4 years. Janet is a popular girl in her class, and she is best friends with Sarah and Anita. Here are Sarah and Anita now.
We're a bit slow because
Hello, I'm Janet.
there's quite a lot of stuff running behind the scenes here.
Hello, I'm Sarah.
The characters are just doing what they do,
Hello,
not being told to do
Anita.
it.
Janet, Sarah and Anita are on the school netball team and also enjoy playing together outside of school. Janet has been in trouble a couple of times for upsetting other girls.
Okay, so these are emergent episodes in that the characters are all shoved into a
The
scene
girls are all playing hopscotch
and left
together
to it,
at break time.
basically.
Frances is late because she wanted to ask the teacher a question, but now she wants to join in like she normally does.
Sorry I'm late, can I play too?
She's now getting miserable.
Wait,
They have
Frances,
emotional
I don't
state.
look anymore when your teacher's pet. Yeah, forget it. Come on. Please let me join.
And her posture shows that she's
The
not feeling
next
very happy at the moment.
the
They have
answer is still
emotional-
no, big face.
insults a bit tricky. So, and then you get advice in between these, and the advice will tend to influence what happens in the next scene. So there's a story facilitator that will decide what to do in the next scene. In this case, the child has suggested you try and make a new friend, which is one of the more successful things you can do when you're being bullied. Nothing is infallible, but this is
Frances
better than
goes
most.
searching for a new friend.
So she's been put in a scene where she could make a new friend, because there's
I
someone
don't
else
really know
there.
many people around here. Do you want to be my friends?
So it's not inevitable that the character's going to say yes. And that's why she's looking a
Sure,
bit upset.
You seem like a nice person.
Okay, so there you go, she's made a new friend, and this will then affect the rest of the story. So the story proceeds in episodes, and although the episode initial conditions are set up, what happens in the episode is not, and then the story facilitator will stop the episode when various events have happened that it recognises, and it's like, that's the end of this episode, and we'll go on to the next episode. So it's an episodic drama. We then tried a more complicated version of this, not with desktop systems. We got very interested in interaction in real spaces. The holodeck, yeah, you weren't sitting at a desktop with a little computer in front of you, you were wandering around in real space, so of course we're quite interested in that. Here was our first go of doing this. This is just it's not actually the system, this is just a video that tells you about it. It gives you a fairly clear idea of what was going on. This is also for education, in this case trying to educate people in cultural sensitivity. So these were sort of tree froggy things. They're aliens. So this is what it looked like if you were a user. You can see there's quite a lot of kit here. We're using that dance mat to navigate. We have a Wiimote, which is there to make gestures with. And we have a phone which you can talk, well, you can name the characters. And we also use the RFID reader on that particular phone to pick up real-world objects and put them in the world. So that's a gesture. We were trying to avoid natural language interaction. This idea of talking to graphical characters, still not there yet, I'm afraid. Technology's not really up to it. You can just about do it with adults for limited numbers of things, as you'll see in our next one, but it's generally not there, and particularly not for children. children's voices mess up most speech recognition systems still. So we've lost the sound on this one, don't quite know how that happened. That was a thing that appeared on the phone to help you, so there's a little character that would appear if you got stuck. That was the sound. I seem to have lost the sound altogether. You understand that? All right. Okay, so that was Orient. We did that a few years ago now. And then most recently we've done a slightly more human-looking version of this in a thing called Traveller. I do hope the sound's going to work though. And you'll see it looks as if it's branching, and it is from the point of view of the user branching, but the characters again are doing what the characters do. So the branching doesn't really affect the characters. You can do something, but the characters will tend to respond anyway. And this again was because it was educational, and because we couldn't just have natural language interaction. So you'll see our interaction modalities expanded a bit. A little bit worried that I've lost my sound. Just try taking it out. In again. Okay, there we go. This is the yellow dots.
Hi, Grandma.
So it looks a bit different. This is also using speech
Hello,
synthesis.
grandson. You know, it's been 5 years now. 5 years since we last saw your grandfather. He would have liked to be here to see what you've grown into.
Okay, so I'm going to skip some of this because there isn't much time. And the idea is that the grandfather has given a letter over after he died, and this person has to go and search for pages of his journal in order to find a treasure in different countries. So off he goes to different countries. I'm going to skip the rest of the grandmother scene so you get into the bar, which is his first place. Okay, so here he is. Oops. Let's just start where you can see.
In the ocean. It will be an amazing experience. Don't forget to send me a card.
So off he goes to a bar. This gives you some inter-episode action because there's a limit to how much content we can put in here. And the idea is that he gets off the boat and he can't find the hotel.
Do you like this place?
So this is what the interaction looks like. Now we're using interact.
Yes, this seems like a really nice bar.
The idea is that you can choose what sorts of actions
Is there
you
anything
carry out.
you need from us?
But the response of the characters will depend on cultural settings. So you can see that the screen is prompting you.
Do you know where I might find Fairway Hotel?
Just sit and wait for the barman. He will be back in a short while.
That's one of the more negative character responses. They're not being very helpful because they don't like people just coming up to them in this culture, actually. The guy should have sat at the bar and waited for someone to talk to him. And we can parameterise this differently incidentally, and they would behave differently, so we can alter a few numbers and they won't behave like that.
Could I help you?
Here's the barman. So again, we're using gestural interaction largely to do this kind of thing.
Do you know where I might find Fairway Hotel?
Turn left outside Upper Bar and go right at the first big junction. Follow this road for about 10 minutes and you will find the hotel on your left
The
side.
barman's a bit more helpful because he's a barman. And so on. So there's more of that. Oops. Do that. Art gallery, and you have to ask permission to enter art.
Hi, it's you again. Nice to see you here.
Unfortunately, if you fell out with the barman in the first scene, which you can do if you're not careful.
Do you know if the park supervisor is here?
That's him over there. Okay, so you get the general idea. Again, this is a story environment in which we're trying to support different sorts of interaction. There's not an awful lot of emergence in the story in this particular case, but it was an educational system. So I think the moral of this talk is, can we get away from the idea that a story is a predetermined structure? Because unless we do that, we're inevitably going to force people in those stories, if they're users, to follow the predetermined path. So the idea I've been putting forward here is that by giving us strong characters with a range of actions, we're essentially defining a story surface of all the things that the characters might do. And then our problem is more a case of which journeys across this surface are going to be interesting, how we're going to make those interesting stories. Now, without going into a load more stuff, since I'm nearly at 50 minutes now, let's just end on this point. I've shown you characters who are essentially being driven by models of emotion. That's what they've got inside them. They've got that cognitive appraisal model. So all the characters have stuff inside them which tell them what emotional state they're portraying at any given moment. That's why the character droops when they're unhappy, because their internal state says you're unhappy as a result of this appraisal, and that is pushed into expressive behaviour which demonstrates what that state actually is. In dramatic situations, you get big jumps in emotion. So one way of recognising what is a dramatic situation for characters is to look at the jumps in their emotion. And if you're modelling the characters with emotion, you can detect this automatically. So you can see if a character praises something and suddenly gets very angry. That would be a big jump in emotion. So in effect, by using these types of character architecture, you get surrogates for dramatic intensity. And once you have a surrogate for dramatic intensity, you can do things on the fly to manipulate that. So in particular, the characters themselves can think about it. They can run predictions of what's going to happen. So say you're a character who's got one of these little appraisal systems. What does that mean? It means if an event comes in, we can say what emotion the character should feel. If the character's deciding to do something, it can say, if this was an event, what I'm about to do, how would I feel about it? In other words, it can run it backwards through its own system. So you could be walking along the road and this person comes up and shouts at you, and you could say to yourself, if I shout back, what's going to happen and how would I feel about it? So you essentially can do a bit of prediction about the emotional states that are going to take place. And that allows the characters themselves to make some predictions about the dramatic impact of the various actions that they can do in a situation. In other words, you're moving from characters to actors who are thinking about what they're doing from a dramatic point of view. That's where the work has got us to now. That's the sort of the current stuff we're working on. It hasn't got through into systems yet, because it takes an awful lot of time and effort to build these systems. So that's the end of the story, this particular story. You can see I've tried to deal with what's quite a serious problem in interactive narrative, and we have ideas for dealing with it. It's not the only game in town, okay? So I'm not telling you it has to be like this, but we think it's quite a promising way of producing interesting interactive narrative, which to some extent will reconcile that interactive freedom with the need for drama and something that feels like a story. Okay.
Thank you, Ruth. Any questions? Can I ask one, Ruth?
Yeah, sure.
The way you design the characters through the emotions to have certain reactions, does that have any sort of loops, any sort of odd sort of? I mean, is it possible to design this completely? To program this completely?
One of the consequences of this approach is that authoring becomes a different problem. So rather than the author of the story authoring the story, they're authoring the surface of stories.
Okay.
So essentially you're asking authors to let go somewhat, and just think about the kinds of things that could happen, and to think about that in terms of the characters that they're designing. Okay. These systems are not at the stage yet where I could let loose people who are just interested in stories to design the characters. So one of our problems is you have to know the technology to design the characters successfully. So to design the characters, there are a whole set of things. I have other slides which explain how you do a character. They have to have goals, they have to have actions that they can carry out, and incidentally the actions, if you're going to do this graphically, have to correspond to animations in the system. So it's no use giving, the obvious case, a character the ability to climb stairs, only there are no stairs in this particular world, so they can't actually do that. Yeah? You give the characters rules for translating events into emotions. You give the characters emotional thresholds, which is our way of dealing with personality. So in that psychology system we're using, there are actually 20-odd emotions in their system, in their taxonomy. For each of those we define a threshold. Below that threshold, the emotion doesn't affect the character's actions. And we give it a decay factor, so that when it goes above that threshold, it doesn't stay there forever. So once the character gets angry, it doesn't stay angry for the rest of the story. That would be unfortunate. Okay. So different characters have different thresholds and different decay factors, and that gives them essentially, over time, a perceived different personality. So a fearful character has a low threshold for fear. Their fear affects their actions quite quickly. And they have a slow decay, which means they stay scared for quite a long time. A bold character would have a high threshold. It has to be very scared before it starts affecting its actions. And a fast decay rate, it doesn't stay scared for very long. Likewise for angry characters and so on, and cheerful characters. So effectively you can design the disposition of the characters and how quickly they'll react to changes in their emotional state. But as in all bottom-up systems, you're throwing the stuff in, and like the game of life, remember I said this? You can't see what's going to happen until you run it.
Yeah.
All bottom-up systems have this characteristic. So essentially what you have to do is run little bits of the characters, and are they doing the right kind of thing here? Are they behaving the way I expected them to behave in this situation, or is there something very odd about the way they're behaving? Yeah? Which is not how authors normally do things, in my experience. Yeah?
So I was going to ask, the way that you describe it, like AI and the system in general, is primarily just on the character.
Yes.
But then the way that we deal, it's like in normal situation, the objects and the bodies are not separate, so they're all kind of universal, connectedness in the whole experience. So for instance, if I go to a bar and then kind of I'm in angry mood, I see things in kind of darker and kind of that affects me. So
Yeah, cinematography. We've tried to do a certain amount of this. We did at one point do some work on the camera angles, but the fact is that if you're a user in this situation, the user is the camera, you can't control the camera very easily. We could control, according to what we think the user's emotion is, how dark the thing appeared. That's not impossible. But we'd be inferring the emotional state of the user.
But then what about all the other connections? Like you have all the other characters in the bar, so I go with dark mood, and then I make bad comments. So I'm not interacting only with one user, one of your agents, because the agent could also interact with the other one.
Oh yeah. That is kind of handled, although it's not easy to do multi-way interaction from a technical point of view. We've done it with sort of 3 characters, but doing it with 6 is a little bit tricky, mainly for other reasons to do with turn-taking and where everyone stands and things like this. There are sort of technical issues for multi-person interaction which are not necessarily very simple. But the character's emotional state, as modelled in the character, will affect everything the character does. So it's running an action selection mechanism all the time. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? It's got goals. It's got an emotional state. And both of those will affect what action it picks. So yes, if it's in a bad mood, it will do a lot of things which reflect the bad mood, depending on its decay factor. It could regain its composure quite quickly. But yeah, it would be quite easy for the character to get into a negative spiral and piss everyone else off in the bar, and then they'd be nasty, and then you'd feel even worse and get really cross. Yes? That kind of dynamic is inherent in the bottom-up approach. You don't really have to do anything for that to happen. It's more of a problem stopping things from getting out of control. So the dramatic mechanism I suggested, we did try this out in a small project. We don't have a graphical version of it. Pick the most dramatic action, the one with most emotion associated with it. It would be something you could do for the characters, if you wanted the characters to be dramatic. But in the scenario we picked for this, where they were looking for aliens in a pyramid, I must say, everyone starts getting shot in about the first 2 minutes. Yeah, because being all that dramatic in just when you started the story is probably not such a good idea. So we've started looking at dramatic trajectories from an actor point of view, Yeah, so you probably don't want to remember what your dramatic trajectory is. This would be probably something like dynamically varying threshold, technically speaking. So you could be much less affected by your emotions than if you're a character in the initial bit of the story. You could be calmer, yeah? And then you could lose it as the story goes on. This is what we mean by losing it. You depress the threshold, and now just a little bit of upset, and the characters get really cross. Suddenly get much more upset than they were in the early part of the story, or at least predict more emotion and do more dramatic things. So this idea of a dramatic trajectory can be reformulated, not in terms of actions, but in terms of emotional states. And that's essentially what we're trying to do here. Yeah.
So doesn't it turn out in a way that with this bottom-up approach, you have a lot of kind of apparent indeterminacy in what happens?
Yes, that's the idea.
But because of the things you've just been talking about, you have to actually put in various kinds of controls and things so that it all makes some kind of sense. So what you're actually doing is introducing some kind of top-down perspective.
Yes, exactly so. So you can think of the system that you'd like as a system that exchanges constraints, if you like.
Yeah.
So the constraints of character come up from the bottom, and the constraints of coherence come down from the top. So we have an agent, an invisible character, who's actually designed much like the other characters but doesn't have a body, called a story facilitator. And we think of a story facilitator as having what we call story shaping capabilities. So this is not the same as a director who'd say, do this, go there. It doesn't do that. It doesn't tinker with the internal state of the characters either. The characters do what the characters do. But it has mechanisms for influencing the characters. So, as I said, external events. You could bring in another character. You could create a heart attack in one of the characters if you wanted. That counts as an external event as well. If you look at soap operas, authors do this kind of thing. So, everyone in Emmerdale Farm was wiped out by a plane crash at some point, I believe. They obviously felt the characters had exhausted the dynamic tension. Any bunch of characters in one story world for long enough, and you start to run out of interesting potential, I think. So in this case, it was a rather dramatic one, with the crash of the plane and a whole new set of characters, with new attributes and so on. Dallas, they machine gun everybody, the same sort of idea, a little bit drastic. And of course, they had to put everyone back later in Dallas because people were so cross about that. So yeah, we would call this top-down stuff story shaping, and the idea is that you're delineating the boundaries. Game masters do this all the time, incidentally. Game masters are not allowed to tell characters what to do. Yeah? But they can tell characters what the consequences of their actions are, and in the same way in a graphical world you can determine some of the consequences of actions. Although, as I said, if you're Robin Hood, missing every time you shoot the Sheriff of Nottingham is a bit of a giveaway. But it's still a mechanism you can use, yeah, if you want to. So you could choose whether a character is actually killed by a monster shooting at it, if you want to. And people habitually do this in desktop roleplay by rolling a dice, and sometimes by cheating, I think, by deciding what they think the better outcome for the story would actually be at this point. So a lot of these mechanisms are used ad hoc by people who run these kinds of interactive story worlds. What hasn't happened so far is any systematic incorporation into computer systems, because they're quite difficult, a lot of them. It's not sort of simple, branch here, branch there. It's much more sort of complex understanding of what you can do to shape a story, to make it interesting for people, possibly move it in a direction where you'd like it to go, without having to say to the characters, do that, you can't do that, you can't do this.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it seems as if that's a very complicated problem. But at some point in what you were saying, I was thinking about chess. So suppose you had chess games, and some chess games are interesting.
Yeah, exactly so.
And some of them aren't. Well, you can imagine a system in which somehow the chess game emerged bottom up from the activities of the players.
Well, the chess game does, in fact.
Well, I suppose that's true. And it would be guaranteed that you always had the chess game, but it wouldn't be guaranteed that it was necessarily an interesting one.
Yeah, and in fact my original example was not chess but football,
right.
Soccer. And the reason I thought of this was that surprisingly often you get dramatic incidents in football games, surprisingly often given that it's in principle people kicking a ball around and scoring goals. Yeah? But you get lots of dramatic little stories to do with the personality and the history of the players and so on, and the history of interactions between the two teams and all the rest of it. So, you know, the golden boy of national football team with a flawed character who loses his temper and kicks someone and gets sent off and his team lose the match and exit from the competition. Yeah, that's one I remember. Oh, the daring new young person who comes in with 5 minutes to go and saves the game. Those sorts of stories happen surprisingly often in football. They're not in the rules of football. They're dramatic structures which emerge from the sort of interaction you get in football games. And then, as you point out, you get some very boring football games from a dramatic point of view. Yeah? So the whole thought that we've been putting into this since we originally had the idea is, what do you have to do to produce more interesting bottom-up structures rather than less interesting bottom-up structures? And our two answers so far are, give the characters the ability to choose more dramatic actions with some metric of what that might be, okay, which involves rerunning their own architecture, so it's quite economical actually. Yeah? Indeed, you can do a theory of mind, working out what other people might be like by running this kind of architecture as if for other people, okay. What would they do? What would I do if I was in their shoes? Yeah? You can easily run the architecture again like that. And then the other thing is this idea of story shaping and having a story facilitator. And story facilitators are normally there when people do role play in educational settings. You normally do have a facilitator. The facilitator doesn't stop people and tell them what they have to do, but will often supply external events, may stop them if things get really off the edge. They're sort of diverging wildly away, will often supply things that have happened in between episodes. So doing this kind of thing episodically also helps. I was very interested in the Jean-Luc Picard, on to the next chapter. That gives you time for things to have happened in between and deals with some of the problems of things happening in real time, which are some things that have to happen in real time aren't inherently interesting, and some of the things that have to happen in real time don't happen where you are. Yeah? So there's a locality problem in these environments. You are where you are in a graphical environment, and if something interesting happens but several hundred miles away, how do you know about it? Okay? So there's a role for gossips and newspapers and things like this in these sorts of stories as well. So there are lots of interesting things to do. Like I said, I don't guarantee that this is the answer, but I think there are some answers in here which get us away from this, how do I coerce the user problem that we have if we do it top down. The user's got to do what I want them to do, basically.
It seems like, in principle, it's likely to be very sensitive to the, I don't know, the structure of the story space, or something like that. So that, you know,
yeah.
you have these characters and they can do various things, and you know, that might create a massive range of different possibilities.
It might. It depends how you set it up in the first place. So my brother used to run, when he had more time than he has now, a sort of afternoon role play for a family event. So this was a role play, just sitting down role play, that would go on for 2 or 3 hours normally. And he had a method for doing this. I played one of these. Well, at least I helped someone who was a better game master than me play one of these. It involves 5 to 8 characters, the one I was involved with. The characters all have secrets. It's a good fertile thing for dramatic introduction. So they don't all know everything about each other. They have a common interest. In this case, they're all trying to escape from a planet which is being invaded by nasty aliens. They've all got together, they've gone to a space station, and the idea is the space station will stuff them on a ship and they'll escape like this. They get to the space station, and when they go to the space station, they find it's deserted. So they're now in a situation where they don't know what's happening exactly. Okay? And then they discover signs that bad things are happening, nasty dead bodies and things like this. They also discover eventually that there's a self-destruct device that's going off in 24 hours and will blow the whole place up. And then they discover there's a spaceship which will only take 2 people. You have to have a specific range of skills in order to pilot it, and there are 5 or 8 of them. Okay, so this produces an interesting story. It doesn't produce the same story any 2 times you run it, I don't think, but the ending is sort of similar. I mean, in the end, some people escape, sometimes, but which people will vary. Or nobody escapes. whole thing blows up with everyone on board. Or some people nearly escape and their spaceship gets blown up. They're not quite quick enough. That's what happened in the one I played. And these are what you might call family resemblance things in that story space. The position of the group in the story space, I've noticed, can be manipulated by external threat. So inherently, they all are at each other's throats. Someone is a spy for the aliens, but we don't know who. Somebody else is not who they say they are. They're masquerading and have plastic surgery, and they're really not the character they claim to be. I forget what all the other secrets are. There are lots of different secrets. Some of the characters are out to get the other characters. They've got valuable information, and so on and so forth. Yeah? So you can manipulate this dramatic situation by giving them external threat, which pushes them into cooperation. So if you attack them with monsters, they all have to band together and fight the monsters. Yeah? If you put them in a situation with the pressure off slightly, they start conspiring. That's what I noticed. If you send some of them off somewhere else, 2 of them were sent away to try and defuse the bomb, which in fact you can't do in this particular story. You can only make it blow up quicker if you start fiddling with it. And the 2 went off to defuse the bomb, immediately started conspiring with each other against the rest of them. Yeah? So that was because of the parameters of the drama. You didn't have to tell them to conspire. Right? They just started doing that all on their own. And some of the others back in the other location apparently were conspiring as well. So all sorts of interesting things happened in this story, but they're all kind of within the story world. They're all the same sort of thing, but they're experienced quite differently if you're actually doing it.
But setting the whole thing up seems as though it's going to be a very... I mean, it's a sort of job that requires a lot of insight and probably experience and that sort of thing in order to make sure that you've got some kind of set of constraints that make sense. As opposed to a set of constraints that's likely to result in incoherence or...
Yeah, absolutely. People who do this kind of thing appear to have, as craft people, internalised quite a lot of this. So if you talk to people who run LARPs, for instance, as we were, they've got knowledge of how to do it, what works, what doesn't work. They have horror stories about things that have gone wrong in the past, why they went wrong, all this kind of stuff. Yeah? So there is practical knowledge of how to do it out there, which has not really been very accessible for people in computing until you go and talk to people. And of course what we're trying to do is to produce authoring systems which include some of this knowledge, which will guide you into crafting something that would be interesting, preferably without knowing the technical detail. Yeah, it's very difficult to do that, let me tell you. But I think if you practice this, if you do a few of these, I mean, my brother got quite good at this. He obviously had internalised some of the principles for producing interesting stories after he'd done several of them. So I chatted to him about some of these things and sort of extract some of these heuristics that he's been using for producing interesting dramatic interaction. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ruth. That was fascinating. Okay, it's just